Hi, and welcome back to Sustainability Mindshift, where we are exploring what it takes to be a sustainability leader today, including the skills and the capabilities and the mindsets that are essential for success. I'm your host, Brad Pierce, and we are super pleased and lucky to have Laurel Patterson here with us today. Hi, Laurel.
Hi, Brad. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Laurel. Laurel Patterson is the head of SDG Integration for the UNDP's Global Policy Network. And the UNDP, for those of you that don't know, it stands for the United Nations Development Program, which is one of the many programs affiliated with the United Nations. Laurel has held several positions at the UNDP. In fact, she's been pretty much a lifer there. And that includes her role as Senior Global Policy Advisor, leading integrated policy development for SDG implementation. And that was in fragile and conflict-affected settings. She's also been the Deputy Director of the UN System Affairs Group, leading the UN reform. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that today. And several field-based positions, including Chief of Planning in Somalia. She's held a variety of positions in Africa. Before joining UNDP, Laurel was the Associate Director of International Affairs at Simon Fraser University in Canada, where she's from. And where she also led the university's international development portfolio focused on primary education in Africa and Southeast Asia. Those are some interesting positions you've held, Laurel. Well, let's kick it off. It's really exciting. As we know, we're here in the lead up, and when this is actually released, it will be fully ongoing. The United Nations Conference of Parties, COP26 in Glasgow. And we'll be exploring with this cohort 2, actually, we'll be talking about what does it take to get the level of ambition and action that the UN has been calling for in this decade of action. And that's, as I like to say, beyond the blah, 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 as I love that Greta Thunberg has said recently, getting people to really think about what they're saying and what they're really doing, walking the walk instead of just talking about it. So what's needed for that kind of transformation? And Laurel here today is going to be talking about the work she's been doing at the with UN in SDG integration. So love to just hear about, what does SDG integration mean? Those are big words.
Brad, thanks. And it's great again to join you. Thanks for having me. So for those, I presume that most people are probably aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a global agenda which was agreed by all world leaders in 2015. And one of the things that I think is particularly powerful about this agenda, I think this is the world's first systems agenda. And so the point, as much as it is the 17 goals, which Brad are behind you right now, is actually the interconnections between them. It's a universal agenda and it's an interdependent agenda. And that was always important. It was important when my unit was set up, which was in 2019, to look at what drives and what could support solutions for really complex development challenges that cut across many of these. There would be all kinds of zigzag patterns, Brad lighting up behind you. But it's taken on new dimensions, of course, in COVID, when we cannot escape the interdependencies and the interconnections between the challenges that we're seeing in climate, the deepening inequalities that we're seeing, and all of the ways of this showing up in people's lives. And all of us, of course, connecting in conversations like this from home. I'm in my son's bedroom right now. So this is sort of a really important moment, we feel, for this kind of a discussion, which is not about solving one or another challenges, but understanding the ways in which they're intersecting, interacting, and then getting very, very as practical as we can, as action oriented as we can, in making progress, recognizing there's going to be no silver bullet here, and we need to find solutions that actually hold the complexity and don't try to simplify it out.
Yeah, that's a very helpful explanation. And I love that you did say that there should be a bunch of zigzagging lines going between this. I'm sure, if you put enough lines in there to show how connected all these goals are, it would look like a spaghetti to some people. Speaking of which, so how do, leaders now today are faced with increasing demand for action around the SDGs and reporting, especially having metrics and reporting on them in their annual reports. And I've seen a lot of big companies, including them and doing a great job pointing out where they have the most impact, and both positive and negative. So tell me more about businesses. How do they, as they're looking to sort of make sense of this and think about what SDGs mean for them, what's happening in the business world from what you're seeing?
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot happening. This has been an agenda that has certainly been embraced by private sector. Globally, you hear a lot of big organizations talking about aligning their investment portfolios with the SDGs. A lot of this work in this area, but also locally and for smaller businesses at the community level, identifying within their ecosystems of partners and customers and community members and beneficiaries and so on, how are they making contributions towards this agenda? And again, to pick up the COVID moment, I think this is really a call for all of us, and it's been a deep sense that many have felt in allowing people to express, make a contribution and connect with a greater purpose, particularly with all of the challenges which we're seeing around us. So I think this is an agenda that allows people at varying levels from global to community to be able to get involved and practically support different aspects, different considerations, which are all a part of this global agenda. In terms of where I think businesses have been particularly active is, of course, in climate, and there's major discussions which are coming up, incredibly important in Glasgow towards this end. Certainly, many companies that are thinking through their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, different aspects of ESG investing, are also looking at these considerations around social cohesion, around inequality, and the changes that they need to make both within their organizations and with the communities in which they operate and communities in which they're serving, to be more supportive and more aware of some of those divisions, which can be, for many people, invisible. It's very difficult to put your hands on some of these challenges. So I think there have been significant investments in those spaces and conversations as well, too.
Yeah, and interestingly, I love that the SDGs are starting to get companies to think more systemically too, because of just the inherent nature of what they represent. Is each of these things behind me are not just some sort of standalone goal that you can set or address or invest in, as some goals may have been, sort of seen in early days of sustainability, very sort of, I would say, inward thinking, many of them, sort of like, what are we doing and what are we going to do to impact our little sphere of influence? But yet, today you can't do that. You have to look at what, your competitors are doing and the rest of the stakeholders in your larger ecosystem in the planet and society, and how are we going to work together to help meet these goals? And so have you seen, COVID's a perfect example of that, I think, right? Is opening up people's eyes and exposing people to the fact that these systems are interconnected, and you can't just hyper invest in one or overlook another one at the expense of of where your focus is. So tell me more about what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about a crisis is you hear this rhetoric sometimes, and I think it's on all of us to ensure that it is the truth, that it's sometimes only a crisis of a magnitude like this that can really spark the transformations that we need to see. And I think what's important in saying that is that we need to do our best collectively, not to look for the fixes in the system, not to try to identify what is broken, how do I feel that, but how do I reimagine? What is holding this particular system in place that is not serving us? And we know that, we sense and we feel that. So what does it take to reimagine the system? Not only to sort of say, oh, here's a gap, or here's a problem, here's where we can do better. And what I think we've seen in COVID, I had an opportunity earlier this year to join a panel of business leaders through something UNDP runs called our Business Call to Action, that were all sort of articulating what this has meant in very different ways for the way that they're connecting with communities that they serve, the way that they are partnering both with government differently, with other businesses in ways that they haven't before, to be able to ensure that not only their business itself is secure, which is important to them, of course, and important for the many people that work for them, but that business is one that is connecting where it can be most valuable, perhaps seen a little bit outside of what that might have meant in the past. They're using their supply chains differently to provide PPE where communities may have needed those, or being able to partner with government and with other actors to provide virtual access to medical services and doctors and so on. And those are important things for people in COVID, but they have the potential. They're building these bridges with communities, common understanding across businesses and new coalitions and so on, which then have the potential sort of for that collective reimagination of the systems in which we're living in now.
So tell me more then. You just mentioned the word sensing, because I'm hearing that businesses need to think in new ways and be creative about the partnerships that they have with various stakeholders in their communities and in the supply chain. So, and it's not necessarily traditional types of partnerships that they would have. And I love, again, you said the word sensing. So tell me more about the work that you and I have talked about before about how business leaders can be trained. And really, it may be innate in us, and so it's more a matter of just helping bring it out to the surface. But how do we sense into these new opportunities? What's the work you're doing there?
Yeah, great. I mean, one of the things that I was going to say earlier, when we go back to the 17 goals behind you and all the zigzags across them, would be to imagine those as always changing and moving. And so one of the important things to bear in mind, and we know that because we live it, but we sometimes change the rules when we articulate that in our professional workspaces, that these are dynamic and moving systems and relationships, and the ways in which inequality is impacting poverty levels or education or access to health in a particular community or part of the world can be different somewhere else. There's different forces, and then even when we understand them, they change. So part of the training, if you want to see it that way, is how do we stay alert to the emerging present? And that is a very difficult thing to do with all of the challenges in which we face, and we never feel that we have enough time, et cetera, to be curious and able to inquire into the current moment. What are the circumstances in which I'm operating? Where are things changing in this environment that I want to notice, not because I have a direct responsibility for changing something in that area, but in the noticing and the understanding of this different dynamics and so on, we can start to sense patterns. And that can then help us to navigate, particularly as we've seen in COVID, where we don't have all the data, we won't have all the information, but we're compelled to make decisions in real time. So how do you do that with confidence, not get paralyzed? And so part of it is really being able to understand and sense into and ask a different set of questions of what's happening within us. So Brad, to go back to some of the earlier conversations we've had, as well as in the environment around us. And there's different protocols and approaches, there's different tools and so on, leaning towards sense making, which allow us to do that. And in doing so, at least for the work that we're involved in at UNDP, reconsidering the way that we're supporting our partners, less so in projects, sectors, and pieces, and more in portfolios and outcomes and impact. So it has a very tangible return in terms of both the organization of how we work and the focus areas within it.
Wow. So, and that's the work you're doing with, I know some of the part of the work that you're doing related to that is this Transforming Systems in the Decade of Action, a global dialogue series, right? You've got this cool thing that you're doing, I know in partnership with the work that is around Theory U and Otto Scharmer. Tell me a little bit more about that, just to go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, it's something that has been really a powerful force in the organization, but certainly a powerful force for me. So when we're thinking about an integration portfolio, and we're looking at the glue and the ties that bind between these SDGs, we're asking ourselves questions around data, around analytics, to help us drive an evidence base of these connections and collaborations, interdependencies. We're thinking about financing, we're thinking about policy applications, we're thinking about how we learn, and maybe we'll be able to come back to that a little bit differently. But what I felt I was not sufficiently exploring was my own role in transforming systems as part and parcel of those systems, and in no way separate from them, irrespective of the development context that I'm working. What was so powerful of the work and these dialogues, which we kicked off last year in the middle of COVID with Otto Scharmer and the Presencing Institute team, was really around bending a beam of observation back to ourselves. And it was this fundamental quote, which we still revisit often, which is that the success of any intervention is dependent entirely on the interior condition of the intervener. And that's not a normal way that we think about having impact and success metrics, whatever those might be in a particular industry out there. The notion then gets flipped, and we're asking ourselves, first and foremost, what is happening in here? What are the motivations that drive me? What are the blind spots that may be holding me back? Am I cognizant of the echo chambers, particularly in COVID, when our personal networks are much smaller than they used to be? We tend to be even more so around like-minded groups. Are we aware of how that can drive the way we see possibilities? So you might say one day, I have no options, and I might say I can see 5 for you. But that ability or lack thereof to be able to imagine these sort of emergent possibilities, that's the opportunity to really rethink and transform systems. And so the idea and the work with Ottawa, now we've taken it across the UN system with many other partners as well too, is trying to build a collective that's sort of curious and courageous and willing to act, knowing that we don't have time this decade for anything less.
Yeah, that's scary and does take
a little
courage.
heavy.
Yeah, in the face of the daunting potential outcome if we don't do it. But even so, you know, in an organization like the UN, which is just enormous, and I've waded in the waters of international development and some of these large institutions too, that you know, they can be mountains to move, and so the work you're doing is really interesting. I mean, talk about that courage that you have to step up to say, you know, hey, we're not doing this right. You know, it's the Greta Thunberg kind of courage, you know, to stand up to the folks that have been thinking a certain way for a long time. And you and I actually talked about something interesting the last time we spoke, that, you know, again, jumping out of the business space for a second and talking about, you know, international relations and people that are working at the UN that have, you know, come out of some really bad conditions. You know, their lives were tough, and in having the opportunity through, you know, starting young, maybe through school, and their parents, you know, had, you know, 10 jobs each to like afford to send them to special school, and they broke out of this community, you know, this cycle of poverty, and then they've got this wonderful respected position in the UN, and they're you know, it's something they want to hold on to, and so for someone to come in like you to say, or others to say, you know, we're not doing this the right way, we need to think very differently, and it's a big risk for them to take on, to actually step forward. It's easy for us to say as first world people, but how, you know, tell me more about that, the courage that it takes for somebody to actually cause change when it may not be necessarily supported quite yet, you know, from the top above someone's, you know, their direct report.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the important things for where we've been starting from, and sort of a driving ethos behind the work has been to democratize the opportunity and the access to is sort of a maybe a complicated way of saying it, but to transformation literacy. So that's not only for particular groups of staff that work in different functions or different parts of the UN, but for anyone, because it's that power of networks and thinking in systems, and then within that, the power of empowerment that can drive collective action. So when we first thought of this dialogue the series, we called it awareness-based collective action. And it was meeting people at this point, which we're all feeling, is that we're hitting a wall as a society, and we don't want to be where we are. And yet collectively, we keep producing results that nobody wants. And we know that, but we're still hitting that wall. And partly in the work that we've been doing, and others have said this more eloquently, they would call it the knowing and doing gap, or the gap between beliefs that I may hold as an individual, but collective actions which don't translate that feeling. So the one thing I would say is that we try very much not to call anybody out for anything. There's really no suggestion here of a critique or you're doing it wrong and therefore there's a right. The idea is actually to try to open up a space with less judgment and more humanity, and give people the opportunity to connect with each other as individuals outside of my job title or yours, the clever things that I should be saying to which you would respond, which would be equally clever, etc. and allow us to deepen into and bring the fullness of our experience to work. And I find personally, it wasn't until COVID, it was clear to me how much I segment different aspects of my life. I know what my passions are, I know what my experiences are, and I know what I bring into work, and I do the best I can. But this opportunity of working through systems transformation and building these dialogue spaces, I realized that I, as a leader in the UN system, can do more, not by trying harder, not by running faster, but by being more present, by bringing more of the fullness of my experience, of my voice, and then holding that for others, just holding it just like that, which is sort of, again, more of a very simple, powerful concept of allowing other people to show up to the best of their abilities and beyond a restriction of professional rank or file or whatever that might be. Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a great lesson for the business world too, even though we were just talking about it from a international development space. I think there's a lot of criticism of business today, which is understandable on some level, especially well, I shouldn't say especially, but some businesses that have caused more damage than others. But I do believe that like you were saying, it's dangerous for us to get in the game of I shouldn't say over punishing, but pushing these executives into a corner, saying you're doing the wrong thing. To your point earlier, you said, instead of shaming somebody, I think the best way forward, and I think what you're saying too, is to create that space for dialogue and create that space for human development for the leaders of these organizations who, like you said, they see they're up against a wall. They know that what they're doing is not going to continue to work, and giving them the opportunity to have transparent dialogue with more diverse sets of stakeholders and listening and evolving together, sensing and emerging together, as you're saying. But it's not a skill that comes easily, so again, that's where I sort of in sustainability Mindshift talk a lot about too, the need for opportunities to learn, whether it's through immersive nature-based experiences, which we're in one of our episodes is with UNDP from Sweden, who takes people into nature and executives to teach them about how to open up to living systems and mirror them in what they do, and others out there, business simulations, et cetera, which we're bringing into this program. But the work you're doing is really cool in that regard, that you're actually advancing that as well. And I can see a lot of the work being done especially in Europe. They even have something now called the interdependent goals, which is really cool to go hand in hand with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. What are you seeing here in the U.S.? I know that as I just said, Europe seems to be a little ahead of us in some of this regard, or other. Shouldn't just say Europe, but other parts of the world. What are you seeing here in the U.S. that's particularly you think relevant and interesting in this space?
Yeah, I'd be happy to get into that. I mean, one thing I wanted to say to your point earlier is that I do think that we need robust systems of accountability. So I don't think that opening up spaces like this in and of itself is the only thing that can drive progress. We need to be held to account for our actions. I do think that you need people speaking out at all levels in different ways and so on. But the perspective here that we're bringing in this piece, as you've also said, that sometimes gets forgotten, is that the only place we ever are is here. I know this can get a little philosophical, but it only ever is today, and it only ever is you. That's it. So the more that we can and if you're uncomfortable with something, it just takes 2 minutes to pick up your device, and you've forgotten about it. You can just move. So to me, the key piece of this is to help us stay in the emerging present, because this is all there ever will be, and we aren't headed anywhere. And then how can you create the opportunity for people to reflect in those spaces? And that to me is then where you get these really powerful opportunities for transformation. It's never going to be you acting on an externality. It will always be from within you. And I think when we think back about major transformations of societies in different ways, this is what it's driven by. It's not driven by a results matrix, and I had said X and now I'm no, it isn't. And we need some of that. Yeah. That was the point I wanted to, but in and of itself, I think that so many people, and we have felt this in the UN system, have so much and so many people in business communities and so many others, there is so much potential of what could be contributed into. And sometimes the biggest barriers are those that we put up for ourselves and within ourselves, actually, whether we recognize that or not. But I think to the point that you're making, I think through COVID, we've seen tremendous shifts in the United States in terms of understanding some of these deep-rooted inequalities and the way that that's showing up in terms of where are people suffering the most from COVID, who is it that's dying from COVID. We've had this tremendous in New York City. There was this moment where there was clapping every evening, just echoing throughout the city for first responders, and a real recognition of people which perhaps in the past were more on the periphery and not something we were valuing in the way that we should. How do you play that forward into action today and for the future that we want? And that's where I think the conversations around racial justice, around climate justice, around Indigenous land rights are starting to take on new meaning, and they're making progress faster. And I think it's that intensity of the moment of COVID that we want to be able to seize for change. So that's where I think we're seeing a lot of it. The other thing that we're seeing in global surveys, which worries me more than we saw in global surveys in 2020, is there's sort of less willingness for people to say, not only do I want to continue these shifts that I've made in my own behavior because of COVID, I can do even more for a better future for everyone. That people are increasingly tired, right? That's all of us. And so those numbers of people saying, yeah, not only can I do this, I can do more than this for longer. The percentage of people saying that has dropped. And I think the real concern for us for any kind of protracted emergency in the way that this is, how do we maintain that vision of an opportunity for transformation, and not sort of say this is too hard, it's too complicated, it's not in my hands, what could I do here? And we sort of we fall back asleep again into old patterns. So I think that's the key, is to stay as much as is possible in situations that are taxing and exhausting, but do try to hold this moment for the opportunity for transformation that it provides us.
Yeah, well, it's got to be hard because we're both trying to, it's a dying system. Sort of this transformation includes, killing an old system essentially, or phasing out of it, and then creating and phasing into a new, paradigm, I guess I should call it, than a system, set of systems. And so trying to, as they say, sort of keep, sort of change, what do they call it? Change the wheels on a plane while it's flying or something, sort of doing that. So it's double time. It's a lot of work. And then on top of that, all the stresses we have from COVID and everything else that's going on, and transformations in our personal lives about how we do business is interesting. What do you think?
And yet, Brad, I mean, so on that point, which you've reminded me as well too, is that when we think of when I think back to the work that we've done holding these dialogue spaces, we also brought 450 colleagues across the UN system to be part of a learning journey, a much more in-depth learning journey. We called it an action learning lab around systems transformation. And what was surprising to many, although it also makes sense on a deeper level, is that so many of the colleagues that reached out who wanted to be part of this action learning lab were writing to us and applying in from contexts of crisis.
Mm.
post-crisis or current crisis or protracted crisis situation. And again, I just think it speaks to the fact that people that are working in these situations, they see the limits of certain traditional approaches. And that's where, that's where the opportunity to shift system is not necessarily in the center where a more perhaps traditional notion of power is held. It is in the periphery. So for those of us that do sit, frankly, more in the center, the question has to become, how do you empower? How do you listen into? How do you provide space for the periphery to speak and share and teach? And so those are skills. You had mentioned listening. It seems like such a simple thing, but that notion of holding space and listening into these transformative experiences, these are where we have the opportunities to really shift course. And for UNDP, of course, the work that we do with our local partners, we have this vast network of accelerator labs that are really focused on locally sourced solutions. It's less about trying to learn something new as much as it is uncovering what's already there, the knowing that already exists. So I think there's an interesting moment that perhaps wasn't there before COVID to really take these kinds of things forward with scale.
So then, you mentioned listening to the periphery and wisdom that exists already, there. It's out there. It's not necessarily something that we're attuned to, but it's there. Tell me, that makes me think of the indigenous folks. You mentioned indigenous earlier, but I don't know if this is particular to all indigenous groups and communities, but there was a real value to the fire circle and sitting around a circle and doing that and inviting your enemy in and listening and sitting around a circle. And I sort of thought of that as, again, around the periphery, who's not just in the inner circle, but maybe who's even sitting around the outer circle. How are we using that kind of knowledge, or how are you using that kind of knowledge and indigenous wisdom in this practice, and any other sort of non-traditional approaches that you might be using?
Yeah, and I think the key there again is this notion of holding space. And I think what can sometimes be a challenge is not sort of listening in for something particular, for a challenge which you may be trying to solve, and extracting it. It can become a little transactional in the way that we have engaged in some practices with indigenous knowledge in the past. So I think that this is more of an opportunity to listen in more generatively and create spaces for people to share the fullness of that experience, rather than looking for the thing that you yourself may find particularly valuable in a particular moment. So what comes to mind in some of these dialogues is and what's interesting is that there's deep, there's other words, of course, and use of stories and other practices and so on to tell, to give a sense of the importance of systems thinking and systems approaches without using those words themselves. We found, certainly in the work that we've done across the UN system, that resonates for many colleagues that say, this is a practice which I embody. I understand it from my culture or particular traditions which I have, but these aren't the words that I use to describe it. So I think part of what's important is also understanding positionality, and that there is a plurality of terms and experiences. So we don't want to lock in a certain way of talking about something which is actually quite a broad experience. The key would be to value it as it, as people experience it in communities, and then try to ensure that that's connected up and valued in larger systems transformation, whether or not those are the words that are used. And in many cases in indigenous practice, I don't profess to be any expert there, but it's certainly that isn't the prevailing terminology that's used.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier in a conversation, having the not just honoring what you're doing today, but as indigenous folks, at least I can attest for Native Americans here in the United States, honoring the seventh generations, both past and future. So you're not just making decisions anymore for today as we do in quarterly, for shareholders, but you're really thinking about what does this mean for the future.
And I think a way that can be sort of picked up in practices that resonate with people is thinking through what do we want our legacy to be? What do you want your legacy to be? These notions of legacy, and not waiting until the end of your life to try to think about what that would be and act in it and within it. And I think the more that people are exploring living legacies, it becomes very clear what really is important for an individual, for a community, for a set of relationships, and then work towards that. And there's no shortage of reflections. Nobody on their deathbed says, I wish I had have worked more. I wish I had have picked up just two
wish
more.
I had better quarterly earnings.
Two more. But it's easy to forget, especially at the pace at which our lives move. So I think some of those practices brought more practically into our space of what do we want that legacy to be. It helps us stay focused on our values, but that also connects us, right? Whether you're in business, whether you're in civil society, whether you're in your government, whatever that professional work zone might be, these are values that I think can be quite powerful for moving us forward.
And yeah, it's sort of the timeless connection that we all have. I want to end with something you mentioned, which I thought was really cool, but talking about Alan Watts and how life is not a journey to a destination, but it's the experience, it's the timelessness of it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think one of the things that's important if we're going to make the collective progress and the collective choices and decisions that we need to see this decade is that we realize that we're always making them today. And I don't have an answer to this, but Brad, you and I have talked about it, even thinking through 2030. What are the disincentives when we create strategies that take us out of the moment of which we need the action? We felt this in COVID. We needed the action today. And part of what I found powerful about Alan Watts' sentiment that life would be better described as music rather than as a journey is that, practically speaking, we aren't trying to get anywhere. There's nowhere to go. It's always today. Back to that point. So we don't work the piano. We play the piano, and you don't show up only for the last chord of the symphony because you wanted to get to the end. We're not trying to get to the end. We're trying to be more fully present in the opportunity, the experience that we have here. And I think the key is not only because, that may be a better way to live. And I think lots of people are asking themselves those questions, but fundamentally, I think that's where the opportunities will be for the shifts that we need to make. But we can't see them if we're racing down what we perceive to be a one road to where. So the opportunity in those spaces, I think, is not just for what would be an improved quality of life, quality of communities, because we would find the entry points, we would find the opportunities, and we would find the courage to act. If that's a kind of a shift in our mindset that we could make. So I guess that last point, and part of this particular, and it's a small contribution to a lot of really great work that many people are doing, but is to say that shifting mindsets can shift systems. And so we shouldn't forget that potential and opportunity.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Laurel. This has been really interesting, and I really applaud the work that you're doing at the UNDP and SDG Integration. Super important. Let's hope for the best from this COP26, and I look forward to partnering with you in the future. Thanks again.
Thanks, Brad. Great to talk. Thanks.